Welcome everyone to Social Impact Live. I'm your host, Richard Hara, and this is our weekly conversation with members of the Columbia School of Social Work community. I'm pleased to have here with us today Dr. Katherine Shear, Professor of Psychiatry at the Columbia School of Social Work and at the Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons. She is founder and director of the Center for Complicated Grief. So welcome, Dr. Shear, to our program today.
Thanks very much, Richard. Thanks for having me.
You know, one of my students sent me a link to an article that was titled, "The Distress You're Feeling is Grief." And I know that right now we're going through so many complicated feelings related to this pandemic, and there's uncertainty, there's loss and everything else. And I think this program comes at an opportune moment. I mean, as we are sort of looking forward and thinking about, as President Trump put it so bluntly, there's going to be a lot of death, right?
Yeah.
And sort of looking forward, but also just thinking of the losses that we've experienced already. I think in the United States, it's over 10,000 people who've died from coronavirus, and worldwide upwards of 75,000. So I think it's important for us to, at this point, acknowledge those losses, the people that we've lost, and all the lives that have been impacted in the world, in our nation, in our states, in our counties, in our communities, and indeed, you know, in our own school of social work, having lost a student recently. So I just thought we could just take a minute of silence to honor these losses. So if everybody would join with me in this moment of silence, I would appreciate it. Thank you very much. Dr. Shear, so if you could just share some thoughts with us about, well, what is grief? How do we understand grief? And most importantly, how do we support those people who are experiencing grief?
Okay, well, I'd be happy to talk to you a little about that, Richard, and maybe I'll take it one step at a time, because grief is something we all, of course, know, and sort of asking what is grief is sort of like asking what is love, what is life. You know, it's sort of things that everybody, it's an everyday experience. At the same time, I think people often don't know what kind of where it comes from, what it's about, and very often people are blindsided by the grief that they experience when someone close dies, and that probably is even more so in the situations that we're facing right now with the COVID virus. But I think in order to understand what we're experiencing when we experience grief, which we know is the response to loss, that's what grief is. But to know what a response to loss is, we have to know what it is that we've lost, right? I mean, that's what's going to determine what we experience. And I think a really good way to understand what we've lost, sort of the heart of what we've lost, is that we've lost is to understand what our close relationships are and what they do for us. So, and a good way to understand that is to use the sort of psychological theory of attachment theory. I think many of the people on this this program are clinicians who would know a lot about attachment theory, but I'm just going to summarize briefly what that means and how it relates to grief. So we've learned from theorists and researchers, this is empirically based information, that people we're close to do a number of things for us. They provide us with what's called a safe haven, which means they're the people we can turn to when things are not going well, when we're stressed or threatened, and they'll help us, they'll comfort us, they'll help us problem solve, they'll be there for us. And they also provide what's called a secure base, which means that they're kind of on our side. We know they're on our side, and they're kind of out there. They have confidence in us when we go out in the world and do things and learn new things. And so they're really very, very important in our everyday life. We're usually aware of that. They're also people that we like to be with. They're rewarding to be with, and all things being considered, we prefer to be with them rather than be separated from them. And we definitely want to know that they're going to be available and responsive. That's to us. So they do all of those things. And then on top of that, there's been a whole body of research over the last 2 or 3 decades, actually it's probably 3 or 4 now, showing that our close relationships actually have an impact on a whole range of psychological and even biological functions, physiologic functions in our body. So they not only affect us in the ways that we're aware of, but they also have an impact on the way we think, on how we manage and regulate our emotions, on our identity, on how we define ourselves. And they also affect our bodies. They affect our cardiovascular system and our immune system, and our sleep and our eating behaviors, and even the way we express our genes. So they have a huge impact on our life in an ongoing way. And so when we lose someone like that, it really is, it's just huge. It's like an earthquake almost, shaking our psychological foundation.
Well, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question to that, but before I do, I just want to remind our viewers that we do reserve the last 10 minutes of the program for Q&A specifically, but if you've got a question, please write them now in the chat box. We may be able to get to them earlier, and certainly we will try our best to cover as many questions as we can, but if there should be more questions than we can answer now, I think there's an opportunity for people to contact your center directly, Professor Shear. Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely. And our center manager is also on the chat and will answer questions directly. But if you have them after, or if you want to even contact us now, you can go to our website, which is www.complicatedgrief.columbia.edu. And you can learn things there, but also you can contact us through the website as well.
Okay, thank you. Kathy, you've provided a sort of picture of why we're so devastated by loss, because these are the things that support us. These are the things that matter to us, help define us. So how do you adapt? What is the response, and how do we cope with loss?
Okay, so I think that a few more things to say about grief. So if you understand grief as the loss of, usually we're talking today primarily about loss of a loved one. If you understand that as being what happens to all of the different things you're essentially getting from this person, then you can understand that grief emerges naturally. It's really the form, in a way, you can think of it as the form that love takes when someone we love dies. It emerges very naturally, and it's generally speaking very, very strong, and it's complex. It includes thoughts and feelings, thoughts and behaviors along with feelings, and physical reactions along with feelings. And it changes. It changes exactly what you're feeling and thinking, changes often kind of erratically in the beginning, from moment to moment or hour to hour. And then it also evolves over time. But as the response to loss, when someone dies, that's pretty permanent. And so our reaction to the loss is also permanent. So you can think of grief as something permanent. And so therefore we have to kind of allow it into our lives. So it needs to find a place in our life, which it does over time as we adapt to the loss, which was your question. So the very strong emotions and persistent, intrusive almost thoughts, they kind of quiet down and soften as we adapt. And what we have to do to adapt to a loss is to accept the reality of that loss, which sounds like it's obvious in a way, but it isn't. It can be very difficult to really wrap your mind around the fact that someone you love is gone and they're not coming back. And so you have to do that. And then very often there are a whole range of changed circumstances that accompany that loss. Some people call those secondary losses, but there are various kinds of stresses and just changes in the world that occur as a consequence of the loss. You have to accept those, and then you have to deal with them. And you also have to find a way to accept a different kind of relationship with the person who died. So that's part of adapting. And the other part is to restore a sense of well-being, to be able to see a future with some promise in it, and to be able to reconnect with other people and feel a sense of purpose and meaning in your life.
So if I understand you correctly, this would be the quote unquote normal course of grief and mourning. We don't necessarily have a specific time frame for that probably, but at least we have the outlines of what that coping process would look like. But does it matter the circumstances of the death? I mean, as we're talking about this sort of slow-moving natural disaster, and does that impact? Because I have a question here. What would be your advice to those who are grieving for someone who lost a loved one to COVID-19 specifically? I mean, under these kinds of circumstances, is there some specialized advice that we can give?
Right. So great questions, Richard. And what you're pointing out is, I want to just say, you're sort of implying this, but I want to say it directly, is that what I just explained is an overarching framework, a sort of big picture of what anyone is experiencing when they experience grief and what they have to do to adapt. But actually, as you said, everyone does this in their own way. Everyone grieves in their own way, and everyone adapts in their own way. And that said, there are, again, some sort of big picture highlights of ways that things can get in the way of the things that can help adapting, and things that can get in the way of adapting. And there are certainly the circumstances of the death do matter a lot. And there are many circumstances surrounding these COVID deaths that will almost always make it more difficult for people. So do you want me to continue and sort of say a little bit more about?
A little bit more about that, yeah, specifically about the circumstances and how that affects the way that people will grieve, and what we can do to support those people.
Right. Okay. So let me just say that what can derail anything that gets in the way of accepting that reality, or of seeing the future in a positive way, or basically being able to restore well-being, anything that gets in the way of that is going to derail the process of adaptation. And there are things that occur naturally in any grief, but that are sort of highlighted, I think, and even more difficult in COVID deaths, that we know do that. There's some common things that get in the way, and they include the tendency to protest, to sort of say no. I mean, we all want to say no when we first learn of a loved one's death, even when we're expecting it. We have a natural wish to sort of protest that death and to sort of not believe it. It's kind of a sense of strange kind of disbelief, and to sort of search for the person and to start yearning and longing for them, of course. And then there's also very often a natural kind of part of losing an attachment figure, someone that we're very close to, is to feel anxiety and anger and guilt. So everyone feels that, but if those get a foothold in our grieving process, that also can derail
So,
adaptation.
yeah, so regarding derailing the process, I mean, it seems that with quarantines and social distancing and the fact that we can't have funerals and mourn in culturally prescribed ways, I mean, how is that affecting people's ability to adapt to loss now, and what can they do about that?
Yeah. So there are just a couple of other things. That one of them is our natural tendency to develop counterfactual scenarios, sort of alternative scenarios. So maybe it didn't have to happen at all, or it didn't have to happen in this way. And so you can see that what's happening with COVID is so many people are having to die alone, and their families can't be with them, and then no one else can be physically present to comfort and support the people after the death.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, we have all kinds of social and political sort of conversations going on that can be distracting and also kind of troubling and upsetting to people. And so you can see where this COVID situation is very likely to get people caught up in one of these side issues, kind of to get derailed. So I think the way to think about how to help people, we have a sort of kind of 7-step process that has been extremely helpful in the work that we've done at the Center for Complicated Grief, where we've shown that we can help people who are struggling with prolonged, persistent, pervasive grief. And it really applies to helping people right away as well. And so that includes helping people accept grief into their life, to understand that it's natural, and even though it feels painful, that's okay. It is the form that grief takes, and if you let that pain be there, not try to fight it, but also not try to hold on to it, that's one of the things that can be very helpful. You often, as clinicians, we have ways of helping people manage painful emotions, and that's very, very relevant in this situation. We also want to help people just start to open their minds to the things that they care about in addition to the person who died, and help them start to envision things in the future. You're not going to do that right away, but starting as soon as possible to just open that door, not to change anything right away, but to start to think about it, to strengthen their relationships, even though we can't do that in person right now. We can do it in lots of digital ways. And one other thing that's very, very helpful to people that can be counterintuitive is to invite them to tell you the story of what happened to the person, to tell them, certainly to talk about the person who died, and even to tell you the story of the death if they wish to. But the single most important thing that anybody can do to help someone who's grieving in the COVID situation or any situation is to be present and listening, and not to give a lot of advice. We don't need to give advice. We just need to really be present and to listen with our hearts, right?
And maybe that speaks to one of the questions that we got. I'm a school counselor. Do you have advice for how to help a school community support a student who is dealing with a loss when we are in a remote learning situation? What unique things about a death due to COVID do we need to plan for in helping our students and clients? And as you said, it's sort of maintaining connection, allowing people the space when they're ready, right, to talk about the loss in terms of what that loss means to them.
Absolutely.
Right?
I think,
Okay.
yes, I think that's right. And one other thing, Richard, is what you did really in the beginning of this program. We just at the School of Social Work experienced a death of one of our of one of our students, which, as you said, it's very painful experience, and we are, we want to, and we are providing a place to memorialize this person and to express our condolences and to honor her. And I think that school communities can do that as well. And doesn't have to be someone from the community. It can be a loss. I think it's still very worth doing that for the students who have lost family members as well.
Since this is such a widespread experience for people, the question has come up, can we talk about something, sort of collective grief that we're addressing here, and to a certain extent, a community trauma? I mean, how does that figure into the grieving process? And maybe, and what I was thinking about as you were talking about, responses to derailed grief, is what can we do kind of preventatively, prophylactively, to sort of help people ready themselves for this grieving process?
Right, that's a question that we always ask, and
Yeah.
in the grief field, we're asking it even when it's not COVID. And
Yeah.
honestly, I think being as open to the realities as possible while maintaining hope, because that, ahead of time, you don't ever want to totally encourage people to give up all hope, in a sense. And in this situation in particular, we really, many people, of course, are recovering. And so we would never want to, encourage people to expect a loved one's death exactly. At the same time, not to be surprised by it, if that makes any sense. So I do think talking about it often helps. It also helps, interestingly, to allow yourself not to talk about it. So this is a balance. We don't want to be too much engaged in, of course, there's tremendous sadness, and we are all grieving. I think we're grieving so many losses, but we're doing it in our own ways. And part of what that means is that we need to kind of go back and forth we need to find a balance, and each of us has our own kind of individual balance for where we're going to confront the pain and where we're going to set it aside. And that does make it hard to do this as a group, in any kind of unified way, because even in families, one of the problems that comes up is that, two people in a family may be grieving the same loss, but they may be have different balance of talking about the person and talking about the sadness and kind of setting it aside, and and even doing something pleasurable or pleasant. That's very important in grief, to allow yourself that. So, I think we need both sides of this in order to, I think, be maximally adaptive, I would say, in this situation.
So I'm trying not to sort of pathologize the process, but
Right.
are there circumstances where grief becomes derailed and it does become a matter of sort of seeking professional help, do you think? And in those cases, I mean, what are the things that people should be looking out for?
Well, thank you for saying you don't want to pathologize it, because that's one of the things that comes up in this discussion. And we absolutely agree. In fact, really, the things that derail grief are actually things that we all experience. There's nothing, sort of weird or abnormal or sick or anything like that about the things that derail grief. And the circumstances can increase the chances of it doing that. I think the thing that protects best against it is awareness. So what I mean by that is the circumstances of the COVID deaths, for example, lend themselves to developing those counterfactual, those alternative scenarios. It's so easy to think to yourself, oh my gosh, why didn't my loved ones stay at home? Because they ended up dying on a ventilator all by themselves anyway. Maybe it would have been better for them to just stay at home. That's the kind of thing that I'm sure I would be thinking, and that I'm guessing a lot of people think, or there are various variations on that. So just being aware that I really like the Serenity Prayer very, very much. Being aware of the fact that when your mind starts to go to something that you know you can't change at all, to do what you can to try to kind of set that aside, or remind yourself that you're going to have to deal with it anyway. That said, I will sort of just raise the point that if you're a clinician and you're working with someone, you don't necessarily want to say this to them directly or give them advice about this, because you have to help them in a very gentle and a very supportive way to do this in their own way. People have to set aside these kinds of thoughts in their own way.
Well, so it's a bit of a dilemma. We don't want to pathologize, but at the same time, should we be, I guess, sensitive to our clients who might be more inclined to depression or PTSD or any other things that would require additional help?
Absolutely. And one of the things that we've learned in recent years, as we've begun to understand grief better and better, we've understood that it's really very different from depression, for example. So that's an excellent point. And it's closer to PTSD, but it's very different from PTSD as well. So people certainly can have both depression and grief, for example. Right. And there is data that strongly indicates that treating that depression will help people grieve. And if you don't treat the depression, then they are more likely to kind of get caught up in these kinds of thoughts and feelings and behaviors that derail the adaptation process. Yeah.
And this is not a diagnosis, but what about survivor's guilt? People have been asking questions about survivor's guilt. Is that a feature of this counterfactual thinking that you referenced before, and what should we do about it?
Right, absolutely. That's another great question. It's so important, because I think that survivor guilt, and what that means, just in case anyone doesn't know, it means that we have a feeling of discomfort or guilt about being alive because this person isn't anymore. And it really happens to almost everyone. I think it happens to people even who aren't that close to the person. We all feel a little bit kind of uncomfortable or guilty in being happy and going on with our lives in a positive way in the face of someone's death. And absolutely, in this kind of situation, in the COVID situation, there are just all kinds of ways that is going to be writ large for people who are close to someone. And so, yes, it is a big problem, and it can really derail the process of adapting, because you can't restore your well-being if you're feeling like you shouldn't do that. You're uncomfortable doing that. So you need to deal with that. And really, professionals can help. Our work is all about helping people who have gotten kind of stuck in grief, and we do not pathologize it, and we do this in a really pretty short period of time. Other people are also, grief counselors are often pretty good at this. Many grief counselors are good at it, and many clinicians are good at it. So it doesn't have to be pathologized, but it can be helped by professionals.
And it's just such a strange situation where all of the normal supports, the outreach to community, family, physical touch, and being there present to witness each other's grief is just not available. And I'm sure this sort of complicates the process for people and underscores the need for us as social workers and anybody else who's sort of on the front lines to do, whether it's through technology, mediated communication, or otherwise, that form of connection that you've talked about.
Another great point. We don't grieve well alone, and we do definitely need to do what we can to stay socially connected. I think that's one of the things we started to realize and people are doing naturally. But what you're saying, I think there are two main points to make around what you're saying. One is that, we do need support and comfort and help when we're grieving. But no adult, no one really wants to be in that position. It's very difficult to feel vulnerable and have to get help from other people. It's just not something that most of us, we'd much rather do the helping than be helped, actually. And so it turns out that it's really important for a helper to be optimally sensitive and responsive, really, really tuned in order to be able to provide that help. And it's very, very difficult, it turns out. I think we're all learning this, to do that in this way, in this digital way. I mean, we do a lot. It's worth doing. I'm not saying that, but we can't do it as well. And the second thing is the physical touch is, physical touch itself has just by itself has positive effects on our physiology and our emotions. So it's an important piece of, of the support process in grieving. So for both of those reasons, probably others as well, it's really difficult. It is really difficult.
I know we're running short on time here, so I just wanted to get to one question because the second time that it's come up, but any advice to help funeral directors who feel like they are failing the bereaved, yet it's out of their hands? I mean, subject to state regulation. And I guess generally speaking, I mean, so many of these health professionals who are on the front line, what kind of advice can we give them or support?
So I would say that the most important thing, it's very natural to feel what we were talking about before, the survivor guilt. It's very, and you feel a kind of survivor guilt naturally about even the bereaved person. So, because you could be the bereaved, we feel like we could there, but for the grace of whatever, we could be there too. And so we feel a little bit uncomfortable or guilty about just not being in that position. And we know that, if you know that you're not being able to provide optimal services, that's another source of feeling badly. And those kinds of bad feelings within yourself can lead you to be a little bit defensive or abrupt with people. So I think what you can do is, first of all, monitor your own feelings and manage your own feelings as step one. And then really be sure that you're not being defensive and that you are being as kind of open and transparent about what you're trying to do and what you hope to be able to do, and how, and maybe open to suggestions from the family about how they could possibly manage this. Certainly communicating, I guess that's what, communicating openly and as non-defensively and, in as present a way as possible is what I would suggest.
I have a follow-up question to what we were discussing earlier about grief and PTSD, but what is the difference between grief and PTSD? Because there's some grief that has that, sort of traumatic aspect to it. So is there a way to distinguish between the two?
Actually, what we have found is that all grief has that traumatic aspect. I mean, when you think about it, so in fact, we have a paper that we're in the process of finalizing that we'll submit for publication about our research showing that people who have nonviolent deaths have very high levels of PTSD-like symptoms. So you're absolutely right. It's very similar. What's so different is that, trauma is something that happens. Essentially, it happens and it's over most of the time. I mean, there are situations where there are recurrent traumas, but most of the time it's an event, it happens, it's very threatening, it's very difficult, but it's over. Whereas grief, loss of a loved one is forever. So it's kind of the beginning of something. The emotions that you feel in, as you know, in trauma are basically intense fear and anxiety are the center of trauma. You do get other feelings along, a sort of cloud of other feelings around that are similar in both grief and depression, but the center is very different. So in trauma, it's fear and anxiety. In grief, it's yearning and longing and sadness.
Yeah, and it connects to that attachment and the separation piece, I think. And speaking of attachment, final question: children, adjustments, things that we need to think about specifically with regard to children and their grief.
That's a huge topic.
Yeah,
I can't
sorry.
begin to it, but that's
Yeah.
okay. But so the two, I guess, the first thing is that children grieve. They definitely grieve, and they definitely grieve differently from adults. And I guess what I would say is that there are some really great resources for grief in children out there on the internet, and you can access them through our website, among other places. You can also just Google them. But and we also do have a mobile app that we developed that you can download free. It can be downloaded either from an iOS device or on the internet. It's called Grief Steps for Parents. And it's basically does have some information and some advice for parents who are helping grieving children. And I think we haven't updated it specifically. We are in process of updating it specifically for the COVID virus, but I think most of it is totally relevant anyway.
Well, as we said earlier in the program, your Center for Complicated Grief is a resource that our viewers can utilize to ask questions, get referrals as needed. I think I just wanted to bring in this one comment that as we honor our first responders, we should also be honoring our so-called last responders as well, people who are helping other people to manage the loss of a loved one. So I just wanted to conclude with that comment from our audience, and to thank you, Dr. Shear, for joining us today on this edition of Social Impact Live.
Thanks so much, Richard, and thanks to everyone who's here and for all that you guys are doing. Thank you so much.
That concludes today's session. We'll be having our regular, let's see, we'll have our another extra session of Social Impact Live this Thursday with Mishura Akilova to talk about COVID-19 and the impact of the pandemic on refugees. So looking forward to seeing all of you then. Thanks again for coming today, and have a good week. Take care.